You guys, you can wear this pen if you want.
Well, welcome to this session with a giant of the industry.
Yes, I'm really excited about this session in particular. Is like I have been waiting so long for this particular session.
Yes.
I'm really, really happy that this happened. So let's introduce our.
Yes, we're here today with New Frontier Data, and we have two guests today, Giadha DeCarcer and John Kagia. Giadha, welcome. Please, be our guest.
Hello, everyone. Muy buen día, México. Es un placer estar aquí. I am Giadha DeCarcer. I'm the founder and CEO of New Frontier Data, and I could not be more excited to open the day of what I hope is the first of many more events focused on the cannabis market in Latin America and, of course, in Mexico. Let me start by thanking the organizers of this Cannabis Mexico Summit, putting together this great event so expediently with such great layers and aspects that we're going to look at through the next 4 days. Truly commendable. So thank you so much. I also wanted to thank Merida Capital Partners for supporting the industry, but also having such a global vision. In particular, I'm going to have a shout out to Francisco Padilla, dear colleague and friend, and Mitch Borokowitz, Merida's managing partner and one of our esteemed New Frontier Data board members and investors. When I started the company, when I founded New Frontier Data in 2014, what gave me the strength and conviction that I was doing the right thing, and believe me, in 2014, most people who knew me thought I had lost my mind, but that I realized that this market, this emerging market, was based on this unique plant that was already confirmed to have not only recreational aspects, but medicinal and industrial applications worldwide. After 7 years, I think its impact and reach has grown beyond what many of us imagined, some of us did, but it certainly has grown exponentially. And I'm very excited to see that in the next few days here at the Cannabis Mexico Summit, we are going to be looking at many of those complex and wonderful layers that this unique plant brings to bear, from the pharmaceutical aspects to the agriculture, to food and beverage, to investment, to the consumer phenomena that is the cannabis consumer. What's interesting is today the global cannabis industry is evolving in what seems to be very regionally focused centers of excellence. What's happening, even though there are dynamics that are true to the entire global industry, there are dynamics that are very particular to regions, where Latin America as a whole is emerging as possibly a cultivation center of excellence, possible an export hub, but certainly within which Mexico is going to be playing a very important role, especially given its very large potential consumer base and the trading opportunity that it presents. So to get us started on this educational journey and to give you much more data, which is what New Frontier Data likes to do, I could not be more delighted to present to you my long-term partner and colleague, Mr. John Kagia, New Frontier Data Chief Knowledge Officer, who will kick us off today with a macro overview of what's happening in Mexico in terms of the cannabis industry, specifically looking at emerging opportunities and challenges so that you can have this context as you continue to learn and gain insight into other areas and angles of the cannabis industry throughout the next few days. I will leave it with John. Please do tune in tomorrow at noon and Saturday at noon, because we will have two other New Frontier Data team members, Mr. Gary Allen and Mr. Esteban Rossi, who will also speak about the cannabis consumer specifically and agro-businesses in Latin America and Mexico. With that, John, I leave it to you.
Thank you, Giadha. John, welcome, and thank you.
Very, very welcome. Thank you so much for this amazing introduction.
Yes.
Thank you so much. We're so glad.
I'm absolutely delighted to be a part of this conversation. And first to the Cannabis Mexico Summit, thank you for putting this together. What a profoundly exciting moment to be leading this conversation on the future of cannabis in Mexico. Obviously, this is a profoundly exciting time for the industry and for the region, and we applaud you for being at the forefront, taking the leadership. We know it is not easy to put together cannabis conferences, and doubly so in this COVID socially distanced environment. But thank you for putting this together and giving us an opportunity to share some of our perspective. I'd also like to thank Giadha for that extraordinary introduction and for the platform that she has built through New Frontier Data, in which we've been able to, over the past 6 years, really think deeply about the size, growth, and evolution of this industry. So without further ado, let's get into this deck. Next slide, please, and I'll provide some context on what we're going to walk through, and hopefully provide a broad-based perspective about what we've been thinking about as some of the key issues that should be considered as Mexico establishes this market. So we're going to begin just very quick overview about New Frontier Data in case for those of you who might not know us. We'll put what's happening in Mexico in a global context, because I think it's really important to understand how this wildfire of legalization is spreading across the globe. We'll talk specifically about where we currently think the size of the Mexican cannabis opportunity sits. And then we'll talk about some of the kind of socioeconomic implications. What happens when you try to flip this switch from illicit to legal? And then close out with what we think are some of the key pillars that have got to be robustly addressed if you're going to set up an effectively regulated and high-performing legal cannabis environment. So, next slide, please. And so for those of you who don't know us, New Frontier Data is a research data and analytics firm that is focused exclusively on the legal cannabis industry. As Giadha said, she founded this company in 2014 with, at the time, what was a truly far-sighted vision. This recognition that legal cannabis was an emerging economy that was going to have global consequence. And at the time, people really did think we were crazy, particularly in Washington, D.C., where we're based, to be looking at this market at the time. We work with investors, business owners, regulators, policymakers, operators, brands, and other industry stakeholders, both in cannabis and outside the industry, to understand critically where the cannabis industry is today and where it's going. While we're based in the US, we're headquartered in the US, we've got teams not just in North America, but in Europe, and we're building a team in Latin America. And it's just testament to how quickly this industry has evolved that we've been able to kind of grow with it. One point that I think is critically important to understand about New Frontier is that we're not an advocacy organization. We don't take a position for or against legalization, and generally we don't make kind of policy prescriptions based on our favorite approaches. Rather, we take a really robust, objective perspective on what the data is telling us about what's happening in the market, and based on everything we have learned, what we think will happen next. So that unbiased perspective, I think, has been something that the market has really come to value from our perspective. Next slide. So we've used data a lot in that introduction. Where do we collect all our data from? Part of the privilege of our work is we look across the entire industry. So we're getting data from national government sources, from municipal government agencies, from businesses that operate in this space across the supply chain. So whether that's retailers where we're getting data around what products are going out the door, how much consumers are spending, to cultivators who are telling us not just how much they're producing, but how much the cost of their inputs are impacting their business, how much energy they're using to grow their cannabis, how much water they're using to grow their cannabis. So we bring a really robust kind of portfolio of information sources into our umbrella, and that enables us to build this really rich perspective in what's happening in the market and where some of the key things that people should be paying attention to as this market evolves. Next slide. And we don't need to belabor this. Suffice it to say that it has been an absolute privilege to work with some of the biggest names in this industry, both in the US and around the world. It has been remarkable to see some of the companies I used to work with in my past life finally coming into cannabis and being able to serve them, doing the kind of research we used to do with them, before I came into the industry. So we've worked with a lot of different clients and helps them solve some really complex, a wide array of very complex questions. And so, we take a lot of pride in the work that we've had a chance to do in this market. So let's put the legal cannabis market in context. Next slide, please. It's remarkable when you look at this map that when we began looking at cannabis legalization 6.5 years ago, there was almost no green on this map. You had countries like Uruguay, which is the first country in the world to legalize adult use. You had countries like Canada, where medical use was legal. But over the past few years, the pace at which both medical legalization, industrial hemp legalization, and now increasingly adult use legalization have begun to spread, I think is just profoundly reflective of this phenomenal cultural change that we're currently undergoing. And so just kind of 2 points that I think make Mexico really singular in this transition to legalization. One, it's only the second G20 nation to legalize recreational use or adult use, following Canada in that. And two, it joins Uruguay as only the second Latin American country where cannabis is legal. So, there's still some pockets in Africa where there's not a lot of green, but even there, it's changing very, very quickly. Next slide. It's also really important to understand how big the existing cannabis economy is. Because, it's one thing to talk about this industry in abstraction. It's another thing to appreciate that right now, annually, consumers globally, based on our modeling, are spending nearly $500 billion on cannabis a year. So when we talk about legalization, it's not about going to find new consumers who have never consumed cannabis before. It is about taking consumers who are already in this very large, well-established, unregulated market and transitioning them into the legal market. And 2 points to note about this number. $408 billion is it's a very significant number as it is. But this doesn't even capture either the medical uses of cannabis that are increasingly being recognized by very affirmative science, and it doesn't recognize or capture any of the industrial applications that are only beginning to be captured, whether that's fiber, grain, applied materials, building material, industrial materials. So this is really kind of the baseline, the floor of what the total cannabis global economy could be. And I think it's reflective as more stakeholders recognize the size of this opportunity, it's only going to accelerate this transition from unregulated to legal. Next slide. And so just to put that number in context, even as it currently exists in an illicit environment, cannabis is a huge market. It's only a little smaller than things like the beer economy at 600 billion or the cosmetics economy at 532 billion. And so again, just to underscore this point, this is a massive market as it exists. And the countries that are able to effectively make this transition to legalization, build well-regulated markets, are going to be uniquely positioned to capture the first big slices of this pie. Next slide. We often think about what forces are shaping cannabis legalization around the world. And we actually update this slide about once a quarter based on the market dynamics. And I'll just talk very briefly about some of these. One is Mexico's transition to legalization. Why is it important? One, it makes North America the epicenter of legal cannabis. And speaking as an American, I never thought that America would be the one country that's sitting in North America where cannabis remains illegal. And we continue to see fairly strong resistance to having this conversation. But two, given the size of the Mexican economy, not only does it become immediately the largest legal market in the world, but two, I think there's going to be a lot of Latin American countries that are looking at this move in Mexico and going to start asking the question of why they are not doing it. We see this happen in other regions. It's absolutely going to happen in Latin America. Second, COVID-19, while it has been absolutely devastating for many aspects of the economy, has actually been a catalyst for very accelerated demand for cannabis. And so one of the things that we're expecting to see coming out of COVID-19, out of the pandemic, as we return to something resembling normal, is a much greater level of normalization of cannabis attitudes. And as a result, much greater interest in both legal cannabis and the products available in the legal market. So we think that Mexico has really timed this well in terms of transition to this conversation around legalization, given the changes in attitudes that we've seen during the pandemic. Third, there's a concept we've been talking a lot about called legalization is easy, regulation is hard. Mexico is about to go through this process, and I think it'll be a true test of how efficiently a country which has had a really robust conversation about legalization can make this transition to a regulated market. And the challenge always ends up being, how do you create regulations in a large and complex society where everybody's trying to get different things done? We often say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Set a framework that you can adjust, get going, and then make the changes as you go along. Because the longer the time you spend trying to create a perfect market out the gate, the more challenging it becomes to, one, get consensus, and then two, you lose really valuable time in getting the legal market going and getting it competing against the unregulated market. We've talked a lot in our work about this idea of cannabis being recession-proof, and this pandemic has proven that very robustly. Part of the reason why so many governments are now interested in cannabis legalization is that they have seen that even as you experience economic fluctuations, even as you experience economic turbulence, cannabis spending remains pretty consistent. It tends to be one of the last things that consumers cut from their budgets. And so as governments are looking to raise revenues, particularly after the devastation caused by the pandemic, I think there's going to be a lot of interest in looking at cannabis as a revenue source to supplement government budgets, which have been really, really acutely hit by the economic downturn. Next slide. So now let's talk specifically about Mexico. So as I mentioned, with nearly 130 million people, Mexico becomes the largest regulated, or will become the largest regulated cannabis market in the world, which is quite exciting. We've done some initial modeling around the number of cannabis consumers in Mexico. And our estimate is that there's currently 3.1 million annual cannabis consumers in the country. It is notable that Mexico is only the third only the third country in the world where cannabis was legalized by court order. The idea that the right for cannabis consumers to grow and consume cannabis shall not be infringed by the government. It's a really profound thought when you think about how long we've had prohibition as a global institution over the past century. And the other two countries that have done this, the Republic of Georgia in Europe and South Africa, I think have, they're a small minority, but they've stimulated this conversation around cannabis as a human rights issue. So a really profound development there, which Mexico has been ahead of. And then finally, just a quick point about usage rates. Our current model shows that we estimate that there's about 3.3% of Mexico's adult population, so anyone above 16, are cannabis consumers. But if you go to the next slide, I'd like to pull that thread a little. So with 3.3 million consumers, a 3.3% population consuming cannabis, 3.1 million cannabis consumers, we expect that if that is our baseline, the number of consumers will grow as the legal market grows. And here we're showing low, medium, and high estimates for the next 5 years through 2025. And you can see that these numbers actually grow relatively quickly. And we modeled this based on all of the other markets that we have seen go through longitudinal growth. And so by 2025, just 5 years from now, Mexico's usage rates could be, you could have as many as 4.5 million consumers in that market, or potentially even more. One of the things to understand about cannabis consumers, okay, great, we can actually talk about it on this slide. So based on that number of consumers, so going from 3.1 million to 4.5, we then modeled based on the price of cannabis currently in Mexico, how much the average cannabis consumer uses in a month. We estimated how much consumers would be spending, assuming legalization happened. And a few points to consider here. One, when you legalize, you do not immediately convert all of the consumers from the illegal market into the legal one. It takes time. And I'll use Colorado as an example. Colorado has been legal for more than 6.5 years, and we estimate that still it's only about 85 to 90% of the total consumers in that market are buying from the legal market. So even 6 years on, you still have not seen that full transition. So be patient and don't assume that everyone who's going to be a consumer will rush to your dispensary on day one. It's going to take a while to get the market up and running. It's going to take a while to make that value proposition clear to the consumer. Two, the regulatory policies will have huge implications on how quickly this happens. So factors like how high you set the taxes, how difficult you make it to secure a license, where in the country licenses are issued. So if they're only concentrated in the major urban centers, then you lose out on all of the consumers in suburban or rural areas. If it ends up being purely a Mexico City enterprise, then you obviously end up losing a very significant proportion of the country. Regulatory policies have a huge implication on how quickly or slowly a market grows. So this growth estimate you're seeing on your screen, growing from about 800 million in the first year to nearly 2 billion in the fourth year, is based on the average growth rate that we have tended to see historically across all of the markets we have observed. Some markets have grown much more slowly because the regulations have made it hard for the market to grow. Others have grown much more quickly. Final point to make here is, if you look at the year 4 number, at $2 billion, there will still be a $4.2 billion illicit market. So, you're looking at a total market opportunity of about $6 billion, but it's going to take a while to capture all of that. And so, as I would just urge anybody who is informing policy in Mexico to really carefully consider the way in which the market is regulated, to expedite capture of this market opportunity, because this is existing demand. This is not about bringing new consumers. It's taking the spending that is already happening out of the illicit market and putting it into the legal market. Next slide. So where does Mexico sit relative to some of the leading cannabis progressive countries in the region? So as mentioned, at 3.3% of the adult population consuming cannabis, significantly lower than the US or Canada, who are both at roughly 16%, but right in line with some of the other Latin American neighbors. And while slightly lower on the usage rate relative to its Latin American neighbors, its size gives it roughly 3.1 million consumers. Now, something to think about when we talk about how many estimated consumers there are in Mexico. And we've seen this happen in some US states, particularly very conservative US states. So Mexico is a relatively conservative country, certainly more conservative historically than the US or Canada. And so when the government calls survey respondents in Mexico and asks whether they consume cannabis, there's likely quite a few people who will be like, I'm not sure I want to tell the government that I'm a cannabis consumer. Totally understandable. What that ends up doing is that it creates a depressed estimate for the number of cannabis consumers in the market. And one really only begins to see how many consumers there are when legalization happens, when people stop feeling stigma around it, and everyone who and consumers start feeling comfortable coming out of the closet. Why is that important? I'll use the US state of Oklahoma as an example. Oklahomans had reported that only about 7% of their population consumed cannabis on the annual government survey. When medical cannabis became legal in the state, nearly 10% of the population signed up to be medical patients. So more people signed up to be medical patients than exist as cannabis consumers in the state of Oklahoma. That's just one example that we've seen where you've seen this these outliers of very conservative states which had very aggressive punitive laws. So if you got caught with cannabis, they would throw the book at you, where consumers were reluctant to admit their actual usage. And so when we estimate that Mexico may have a 3.3% or 3.1 million users, 3.3% usage rate, let's recognize that that may actually be lower than the actuals, and legalization will help us determine. It's a good number to reference as a floor, so the baseline that you would expect, but we would not be surprised if it ends up being higher than that. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the socioeconomic implications and impacts of legalization. So first is tax revenue. This tends to get government officials very excited with the idea that, you know, cannabis is going to be a cash cow for their governments. We're showing on screen, you know, 6 years of legal cannabis in Colorado, where the state has collected, a state of 5 million people has collected $1.2 billion in revenue since it legalized. And you know, in the most recent year, so in 2020, we expect that the actual tax revenue number is going to be closer to about around $350 million. This is real money. But two considerations here. Yes, cannabis can be a very important source of revenue, but it's critically important not to overtax cannabis, because remember, the consumers of cannabis already have a very well-oiled illicit market that they can get their cannabis from. And so the value proposition that the consumer is making is the legal market has a lot of benefits, and consumers love those benefits, being able to walk into a store, having great product selection, not having to feel like a criminal from getting cannabis from a sketchy guy in a dark alley. You know, there's a sense of clarity that comes from being able to purchase cannabis the same way you would buy alcohol, tobacco, or groceries. However, for all of those benefits, they're not willing to pay 2 or 3 or 4 times the amount that they're paying in the illicit market. They're willing to pay a little more, but they're not willing to pay that much more. So generally, we've seen, you know, in the US, the highest tax rate is in California, which averages out about 45 to 50%, depending on where in the state you are. And that's high. And that high tax rate has actually been part of the reason why California's legal market has underperformed relative to Colorado's legal market, where the average tax rate nets out in total at about 27%. So, and ironically, the lower you set your tax rate, the more money you're likely to make, because the faster you're going to be able to transition consumers from the unregulated market to the legal market. You can move to the next slide. Sorry, Berta. We can't talk about cannabis without talking about the huge opportunity that medical cannabis represents. And I think this issue of medical cannabis has become even more important during this pandemic because of the huge toll that COVID-19 has taken on national healthcare systems. So with medical cannabis, you have a low-cost therapeutic alternative that science is showing is effective for an increasingly, for a broad range of medical conditions. Across the US right now, there are over 65 different qualifying medical conditions in the states where medical cannabis is legal. But the main driver of participation in medical cannabis programs has been pain. And so when we look at the top states, the kind of some of the principal medical cannabis markets in the US, we see that well over half of the people participating in their medical programs are pain patients. And why is this important? You know, Mexico may not be suffering from the same acute opioid crisis, so pain medication crisis that people in the US is facing. But to be clear, this idea of medical cannabis for pain management is a really, really robust opportunity, and something that we would encourage more education, particularly amongst healthcare practitioners, about how medical cannabis can be used not just to treat pain, but also for things like cancer, for epilepsy, glaucoma, arthritis, etc. Because there's a lot of patients who are finding acute relief from medical cannabis, but it's also helping dramatically lower how much they're spending on prescription medications. By our analysis, the states where medical cannabis is legal reduced by 11% their government spending on pain medications. So this can have a really meaningful impact on government budgets, not only by bringing in tax revenue, but also by reducing expenditure on conventional pharmaceuticals. Next slide. It's one of the aspects of legal cannabis that we think remains an underexplored opportunity is this idea of cannatourism. So Mexico is the seventh most visited country in the world. According to the World Bank, nearly 100 million people visit the country each year. Based on what we've seen from other states in the US, where particularly major tourism destinations, including Colorado as a good reference example here, about 8% of the visitors to Colorado participate in the medical cannabis program in the state. So applying that number to Mexico means that you would see nearly 8 million tourists who are visiting Mexico who would be eager and welcome the opportunity to engage in medical cannabis, to participate in cannatourism if there was an opportunity. So why is this important? Given the scale of Mexico's tourism economy, the impact that COVID-19, that the pandemic has had on global tourism, and then 3, the very significant rebound that we expect when the world reopens, we think Mexico is uniquely positioned to build a cannatourism economy just because of the diversity of the country's tourism offerings and the fact that it is a leader in this idea of in establishing a legal regulated market. Now, I think it's going to be critically important that you get the regulations on how cannatourists, so non-resident tourists, can participate in the local cannabis economy. But it's something that candidly very few markets have done. We see places like California starting to set up tourism resorts. We know that there's a robust conversation happening in places like Denver right now. But we would challenge the thought leaders and entrepreneurs and policymakers in Mexico to consider this as a both robust additional opportunity within the cannabis economy, but also a way to accelerate the recovery of your tourism economy as you try and come back from the damage that was inflicted by the pandemic. Next slide. It's been really interesting to watch how the transfer, the shipment of cannabis from Mexico into the US has evolved over the past few years. So one of the things that we've seen is even as the US side of the border has stepped up kind of enforcement and checkpoints, we've seen this really dramatic decline in how much cannabis is being intercepted at the border. And we think there's a reason for that. As legalization has become more widespread in the US, Americans have kind of shown a preference for a product that's coming out to the legal regulated market over the product that was being shipped in from both Mexico and from Canada. Why is this important? First, this has obviously had a very significant impact on the illicit cannabis trade. You've seen nearly a 90% drop in cannabis border interdictions. But two, we think this second step of Mexico legalizing will now be a further kind of undermining effect on the illicit cannabis trade within Mexico. And so the idea of the US relying more heavily on its own legal market production, and then now Mexico transitioning to a legal regulated economy, I think creates this kind of twin squeeze that makes it a really challenging environment for the illicit operators to continue to operate. So if reducing kind of illicit transit of cannabis has been a key policy objective, we think this is going to be a key step toward doing that. Next slide. It is worth noting that while legalization broadly does dramatically reduce the amount of law enforcement related to cannabis, and here showing Colorado again because it's the longest established adult use market, you've seen this really dramatic decline in the number of people who are getting arrested for minor possession charges because it's no longer illegal to possess it broadly. And the people who are getting arrested for possession are generally people who are carrying far more than is allowed under the legal limit. But it doesn't mean that all types of law enforcement related to cannabis go away. So a few areas where you should be mindful that law enforcement is likely going to increase because it's likely going to be part of the regulatory framework. One is driving under the influence. Two is minor possession, so underage people possessing cannabis. And that's been one of the areas where you've seen a pretty significant increase in Colorado. Three is smoking in public, which is actually interesting. We've seen different states where we've seen smoke in public become a really big issue, including in Washington, D.C., where we're based, in part because even though it's legal, people don't have places where they can go to consume. So I'm going to wrap up just with a quick recap of some of the 10 policy implications that we think are worth thinking about in Mexico, and then a couple of closing thoughts. So Mexico, as we've said severally, with 3.3 million current consumers and potentially even more than that in the market, legalization not only presents an opportunity to transition these consumers to a legal market, but also to get those consumers generating very significant revenue, both for operators, so license holders, as well as for the government, to the tune of $2 billion within the first few years. Within that, Mexico's legalization can be a huge catalyst for new job creation across the supply chain. The cannabis industry doesn't just need people to grow it and to sell it. It will need people across the entire industry. So people to process the value-added products, people to make the edibles and other ingestible products. It will need accountants and lawyers, and who are specialists in the law. It will need market researchers like New Frontier Data. So for those of you who might be looking at opportunities in the space, don't just think about these as opportunities that are plant touching. This is an entire economy that is being established, and there's going to be opportunities across the entire ecosystem. Obviously, challenging the cartels is a key policy priority for the government, and we would just say this. The faster you get from passing the law to establishing a regulated market, the more challenging it is for the illicit operators, the cartels, to establish a grounding in this market. So we find that in the markets, in the states where you have a long lag time between going legal and beginning sales, the illicit market tends to move in and become very well established. And then the legal operators have a much more difficult time competing. So the faster you get from legalization to activation, the more successful the legal market tends to be. And then finally, yes, you will see a reduction in law enforcement, but it doesn't mean all law enforcement goes away. And so, just expect that there will continue to be some aspects of cannabis prohibition in this regulated market. So go ahead to the next slide. Next slide, please. There we go. So one of the biggest challenges that every government that legalizes faces is how do you balance this tension between an effectively regulated market and one which can compete against the illegal market? And we think the key way of doing that is with effective taxes, which I think should be a key priority. Another challenge that Mexico is likely going to face is, there's already clearly a lot of people who are growing cannabis in the illicit market. How does one secure a home for those people in the legal market? It's not an easy question to ask, but it also makes it easier to, one, get the market up and running, and two, harnessing what is already kind of local expertise, local knowledge, and a local economy. Because if what happens ends up being that the new regulated market creates an entirely new production infrastructure, all of the people who were in the unregulated market now end up losing their livelihoods, ending up, and it creates pretty significant economic disruption in the regions of the country where cannabis has been important. So just a key point in thinking about how do you make this an inclusive industry, recognizing that there's some people who are doing this in an unregulated market, but should have a path to being able to participate in the legal one. Another key challenge is, how do you define who has jurisdiction over this market? So is it the Ministry of Health? Is it the ministry? Is it going to be the finance and tax agencies? Is it going to be an entirely new agency set up to govern this? Is it going to be the Department of Agriculture? Or do they all have pieces in managing this industry? This is a really, really thorny issue. And I can tell you, the more complicated you make the regulatory structure in terms of which agency operators are liable to, the more challenging it is for operators to be successful. You end up having a trail of lawyers and accountants and other stakeholders trying to keep your business compliant. We'd also just caution about raising barriers to participation too high. There's so much innovation that can happen when you allow people to have a seat at the cannabis table. So one of the ways so one example of doing this is, for example, on the cultivation side, yes, allowing for large cultivation facilities, but also allowing for micro licenses for really small producers who are producing on, say, a quarter of an acre or smaller, so that people can be specialist producers or focus on targeted genetics. There's a lot of opportunity for micro innovation in this space. And we think that as such a young industry on a global basis, the more people you allow to experiment and innovate, the more likely you'll be to see that innovation bubble up to the top and create, really kind of market-leading products or processes that can help Mexico become a leading global market. But the more people you invite in, the more strict your regulations need to be, just to make sure that the product that is being produced in the legal market stays in the legal market. So managing diversion as a closing point becomes a key question. As such a young market, there's a lot of areas for further analysis. And so I'm not going to go through all of this, but suffice it to say, we don't often have as societies an opportunity to watch a switch gets flipped that turns on an entirely new economy. So all of these issues, from how big is the market, how many jobs are going to be created, what is the impact on tax revenues, what is the impact on the healthcare system, how can Mexico leverage cannabis as a vector in sustainability? What does the global market for import-export look like? These are all critical questions that need to be answered, and we don't have the answers to them yet. So we're looking forward to being a partner as the country and its stakeholders explore these issues. And it's going to be a phenomenally exciting time as a research analyst for us. And final slide. A closing thought. From all of the work that we have been doing as New Frontier Data over the past 9 years, so just back up one.
John,
Yeah.
yes, it's been a great presentation.
Great.
We were astounded. We didn't want to interrupt you, and
At all.
we're glad that you got to the end of it and in time, which is doubly marvelous. So, in 3 words, Mexico has opportunities.
Mexico has phenomenal opportunities. And I will say this. Mexico is in a really unique position to lead the world in understanding what a well-regulated cannabis economy can look like. But as the old saying goes, with great power comes great responsibility. The world is watching what is happening in Mexico. And with that comes a burden of responsibility to establish a framework that the world will want to emulate. So, it is an enviable and an unenviable position to be in, to have, so many countries, so many stakeholders looking anxiously at what is going to happen in Mexico. But it's also a profound privilege because, the more quickly and effectively Mexico can establish a well-regulated market, the more opportunity this economy is going to present for Mexico and its people.
Well, we're delighted to have you. It's amazing. We are big fans of your work, of your team, and this has been
a great honor. Thank you, Giadha, because of being you here at this. This has just become the event.
Yeah, thank you, Giadha,
of
John.
the year. Yeah,
and it was amazing presentation. Thank you so much. I think it's the best way to start the summit. And thank you for your time. And thank you all.
Yeah, for sharing this knowledge. As you said, strength in knowledge, and this kind of knowledge in particular.
It's been our pleasure. Thank you very much, gentlemen. And to all the guests, enjoy the rest of the conference. A very, very exciting schedule or panel or series of conversations lined up. And thank you to the organizers. This has been a phenomenal opportunity.
Thanks to you. And we hope you enjoy the summit as long as your own schedule allows it.
We look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.